Welcome to the Waterloo podcast. My name is Martin Aaron. Since the year 2000, I've been building a database of the British Army at Waterloo. By compiling original records from the Public Record Office and Regimental Archives, I've gathered information about each of the 33,000 British combatants in 1815. This podcast series examines that data. Welcome to episode 9 of the Waterloo podcast and the final part of our look at Kempt's Brigade. This week we'll be looking at the 1st Battalion of the 95th Foot. Coming up, we've got all manner of weird and wonderful tales in this episode. Nighttime missions, mock hangings, drunks and elopements, from Egyptology to hunting smugglers. So I hope you enjoy the listen. Please like and subscribe if you do. So, for every Napoleonic enthusiast, the 95th, or the Rifles, will need no introduction, being right up there with the Black Watch and Napoleon's Old Guard, as one of the most famous units of the Napoleonic Wars. The 95th Foot differed from other foot regiments in dress, their green uniforms with black facings earning them the nicknames of the Grasshoppers or the Sweeps. They differed in their arms. They used the Baker rifle, slower to load but more accurate than the standard Brown Bess musket. And most importantly, they differed in the way they fought, abandoning the massed fire and symmetrical manoeuvres of traditional warfare for the use of cover and superior individual marksmanship. There was also perhaps a difference in their esprit de corps and a comparatively progressive approach to discipline, being instilled through their pride in their status as an elite, rather than through just fear of the lash. I should credit some of the main sources for this episode. One of the best books I've read on the Napoleonic Wars is Mark Urban's Rifles. Highly recommended. It does actually contain some primary research and is beautifully written. Also, this book, Rifleman by Philip Elliott Wright. It contains some marvellous illustrations, more of which later. And very importantly, there are several first-hand accounts, 2 officers, Kincaid and Simmons, and very unusually, a wonderful account from the ranks, Ned Costello. This last one gives a fascinating insight into so many aspects of ordinary life in the period, not only military, although he's not always the most reliable narrator, as we'll see later on. So I'll add some links to those books in the blurb for this episode, all very good reads. Now, in the Waterloo campaign, this 1st Battalion fielded only 6 companies, numbers 1, 2, 5, 8, 9 and 10, but company strengths were so high for each of these 6 that they amounted to a total strength of 588 other ranks, which with 22 officers meant they actually had a greater strength than some other regiments in 1815, which fielded the usual 10 companies. In terms of birthplace data available, we've got 520 men from 602, or 83%. And it's never finished. I'm always trying to find new data. But of these 520 men, we can see that 320 were English, that's 62%, with 102 Irish, 20%, 63 Scottish, 32 Welsh, and 4 foreign. The 4 foreigners were a man born in America, that's 23-year-old Lieutenant Gardner, a man from Gibraltar, 21-year-old Lieutenant Cochrane, a German, Private John Lindner from Ansbach in Bavaria, and perhaps most intriguingly, a private named Casimir Zafir from the East Indies. In terms of which counties men were from, there was a fairly broad range, with Leicestershire being the only outlier, with over double the number of men from any other county. Essex and Kent were also well represented, and the Irish county with the most riflemen was Wexford. In terms of length of service and experience, let's look at dates of enlistment first. So, from this graph we can see that the 3 main years of intake were 1805, 1809 and 1813, with 107, 85 and 123 men from those years respectively. This means that 32% of the battalion had over 10 years service prior to Waterloo, and almost 60% had over 5 years. It's important to stress that these are the dates of enlistment into the 95th. Numerous men had served many years previously in other regiments. For example, if we look at the two of the three most recent recruits, the three men enlisted in January 1815, Privates William Bedwell from Kent and William Harvey from Glamorgan, both men had previously served a couple of years in the Royal Marines, enlisting in 1800, so they would therefore be far from green recruits. Another point of interest is that very few of the Scotsmen in the regiment were recent recruits, most having enlisted between 1800 and 1803. Of these, the great majority had actually been serving with Highland militia regiments, the Sutherland Fencibles and so on, since 1794. According to the Rifles Museum in Winchester, this was due to the then Lieutenant Alexander Cameron recruiting over 150 men in Lochaber, Scotland, and marching them all the way to Horsham in Sussex, where they formed what became known unofficially as the Highland Company. They even had bagpipes, which are on display at the museum, and were led by Cameron through the Peninsular War. By the time of Waterloo, Alexander Cameron was 34 years old and a major. He took command of the battalion when Colonel Andrew Bernard was wounded, until he himself was wounded in the throat. In terms of experience, it hardly needs saying that the regiment had seen a very considerable amount of action prior to 1815. In fact, the 1st Battalion Rifles might make the claim that it had seen more fighting across the world than any battalion of any army in the world. It hadn't, however, had much luck in some of its early forays abroad, being captured with the rest of the army during the disastrous expedition to South America in 1805, and also suffering terribly during the Corunna campaign of 1808-1809. But from its return to the peninsula in late 1809 to the end of the war in 1814, it played a prominent role in almost every major engagement, as well as countless smaller skirmishes. Now that we know a little about these men, let's join them in Flanders in 1815. The 6 companies of the 1st Battalion embarked at Dover on the 25th of April on the Wensleydale transport ship and landed at Ostend on the 27th. They were then transported by canal first to Bruges, then Ghent, where they were billeted for 2 weeks before moving to Brussels on the 12th of May. During the night of the 15th of June, the battalion was alerted to Napoleon's advance, and as dawn was breaking, it marched out of Brussels via the Porte de Namur. On arrival at Quatre Bras on the 16th of June, the 95th found the Duke of Wellington already there, surrounded by a large cavalcade of staff. They were in a field, looking towards the handful of houses around the crossroads which comprised the hamlet. The Duke's military secretary, Lord Fitzroy Somerset, separated himself from this group, came over and ordered Lieutenant Colonel Barnard to immediately move forward and take the houses at the crossroads, or, failing that, to secure the wood on the left to keep open the road with which they expected to communicate with the Prussians. However, the brigade had not got halfway before the arrival of overwhelming French numbers at the houses before them made it clear this position could not be taken. Instead, the Rifles hurried to the wood in a race to secure it before it too was taken. The battalion was already exhausted from its hurried march to reach the battlefield from Brussels. The sun was still blazing, water was scarce, and this new rush to the woods was too much for one poor man, who suddenly struck the soldier next to him with his rifle, before collapsing. Kincaid recalls what must have been an extraordinary sight.
One of our men went raving mad from the excessive heat. The poor fellow cut a few extraordinary capers and died in the course of a few minutes.
This man was Private Thomas Burrows from Shrewsbury, Shropshire. He'd been in the regiment since 1805 and survived all those years of hard campaigning, only to die of heat exhaustion near these woods of Quatre Bras. It's finding the identity of these obscure individuals, the men mentioned in a memoir then long since forgotten by history, that's been the main driver for all the research I've done. The battalion checked the French advance and held the wood, simultaneously lining the Namur road and holding that position. Beckswith's company, commanded by Lieutenant Layton, lined an embankment in the ditch in front of it and engaged in a sharp exchange of fire with the French. Increasing numbers of French pushed the 95th out of the wood and threatened to turn the left flank of the Allied line. In response, The men in green rose up from the ditch, countercharged the French, and drove them back. Private Ned Costello, that tough Irishman, leads a vivid description of the fighting and the moment he was wounded.
Being hard pressed by superior numbers, we were at length joined by a number of Belgians and received orders to advance, which we did, driving the enemy through the skirts of a wood and passing a field of rye which obstructed them from our view. However, as soon as we emerged from the wood, a regiment of French infantry on our right received us with a running fire. I was in the act of taking aim at some of our opposing skirmishers when a ball struck my trigger finger, tearing it off and turning the trigger aside, while a second shot passed through the mess tin on my knapsack. Several of our men were killed by this volley, and Lieutenant Gardner, a worthy little officer of the company, was severely wounded in the lower part of the leg.
That night, the fighting over, the exhausted men retired to behind Germiancourt farm and lay down to sleep in their companies, ready to resume the fighting should the alarm be sounded in the night. Despite this threat, Kincaid states that sleep was not hard to come by after 26 hours of non-stop marching and fighting. However, not all officers were asleep. Lieutenant George Simmons had a mission to attend to first. He had seen a man fall wounded during that day's fighting and was determined to bring him back to the lines.
A man of ours was left near the French. When it fell dark, I went with 3 men to fetch him away. Both the poor fellow's legs were broken. I deposited him in a house and joined my regiment. Our division formed in column of companies at wheeling distance, the officers on the left of their respective companies. In this way, we lay down. I pulled a greatcoat off a cuirassier who was dead and covered myself, which made me sleep well till 1 hour before daylight.
At dawn on the 17th of June, a company of the battalion was sent forward to occupy Germiancourt farm before the order was received that the whole Allied army should begin its retreat. Kincaid describes the fields all around as strewn with the bodies of men and horses, and with cuirasses and torn clothing, the debris of the fighting from the day before. Lieutenant William Lister had been shot in the stomach the previous day and died that morning in a house there. With the rest of the brigade, the 95th marched all day through torrential rain, pausing in Genappe before proceeding to Waterloo, where it took up its position north of La Haye-Sainte farmhouse. We mentioned at the beginning how the 95th, as part of the Light Division in the Peninsula, had become masters of skirmishing and light infantry tactics. At Waterloo, however, the regiment was employed more as a traditional foot battalion, its role being predominantly the same as the other 3 line battalions of the brigade. Commanding officer Sir Andrew Bernard describes the regiment being positioned
with 2 companies on the abrupt ground in front, with the hedgerow, part of which was cut down, and an abattis formed across the road halfway up the hill from Haye-Sainte, and 1 company under Colonel Leach being posted in the gravel pit. When the enemy made their first attack, this company was obliged to join the others, and although they maintained their ground sufficiently to change the direction of the enemy's column, they were obliged eventually to retire as it passed their left flank, and to join the companies at the hedge, to which the enemy approached so close that there could not have been above 2 yards, if so much, between their front rank and that of the corps opposed.
I mentioned earlier the book Rifleman by Philip Elliott Wright. It has some superb illustrations, and he's kindly given me permission to share this one. It's a wonderful painting by the illustrator Krista Hook, and I think it gives an excellent idea of what the 1st Battalion's deployment must have looked like. You can see the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte being held by the King's German Legion, and you can see the French infantry swarming around it trying to break in. Meanwhile, in the road outside the farm, you can see the 2 abattis, the obstacles placed in the roadway, made of trees and branches and bits of wagon and whatever they could find lying around. And most importantly for this episode, you can see the indentation from the road here in the centre of the picture. That's the sandpit, a kind of shallow quarry, which is occupied by numbers 1 and 2 company of the 95th, Captain Chawner and Leach. And behind them, on what is described as a knoll, is Captain Johnson's company. Then, way back at the hedgeline at the top of the picture, are the 3 other companies. So you can see the 3 forward companies are lying directly in the path of the huge French infantry formations of D'Erlon Division, which, as we've heard in previous episodes, began the battle proper with their massed assault on the Allied line. You can see them here in the bottom right quarter of the picture, making their way up the hill. The French drew closer, drums beating, officers waving on their men. Kincaid writes,
Our rifles were, however, in a very few seconds required to play their parts, and opened such a fire on the advancing skirmishers as quickly brought them to a standstill. But their columns advanced steadily through them, and our post was quickly turned on both flanks, which compelled us to fall back and join our comrades behind the hedge, though not before some of our officers and theirs had engaged in personal combat.
The riflemen of these three companies raced back to the hedge, where they joined the other half of the battalion. On the French came Captain Kincaid again.
When the heads of their columns shot over the knoll which we had just quitted, they received such a fire from our first line that they wavered, and hung behind a little, but, cheered and encouraged by the gallantry of their officers, who were dancing and flourishing their swords in front, they at last boldly advanced to the opposite side of our hedge and began to deploy. Our first line, in the meantime, was getting so thin that Picton found it necessary to bring up his second, but fell in the act of doing so. The command of the division at that crucial moment devolved upon Sir James Kent, who was galloping along the line, animating the men to steadiness.
Hampshire Archives contains a letter from Captain Jonathan Leach, who, commanding No. 2 Company, recalls that even the combined 6 companies could not stop the vast force of French infantry, and were about to be overwhelmed when the British heavy cavalry arrived to the rescue.
The fierce onset of the French, with overwhelming numbers, forced back my 2 companies and the main body of the 95th Regiment, which was also instantly assailed in such a manner as to render it impossible for one weak battalion, consisting of only 6 companies, to stem the torrent for any length of time. We were consequently constrained to fall back on the 32nd Regiment, which was in line near the thorn hedge which runs from the Genappe Road to the left and along the front of Picton's division. We were closely pressed and hotly engaged in the retrograde movement, and very soon after reaching the spot where the 32nd was in position, a volley and a charge of bayonets caused the French to recoil in disorder and with heavy loss. And it was at this moment of fire, smoke and excitement that the heavy cavalry appeared among us and instantly charged that infantry.
The moment of crisis had passed. Kemp's brigade, seemingly about to be overwhelmed by the unstoppable mass of French infantry, had fought furiously and then watched the entire French column suddenly collapse and turn heel, thrown into utter panic by the surprise arrival over the brow of the hill of the British heavy dragoons and household cavalry. So the moment of danger had passed, and the brigade must have been afforded a period to recover and reorganise. The 3 forward companies returned to their positions ahead of the line in the sandpit and knoll. The French artillery bombardment will have resumed, but the rifles were probably ordered to lie down, like the rest of the brigade, to minimise casualties back behind the hedge. However, later in the afternoon, the French came again, surging around the farmhouse of La Haye Sainte, and soon a new crisis threatened. Captain Kincaid again.
Between 3 and 4 o'clock, the storm gathered again in our front. Our 3 companies in the knoll were soon involved in a furious fire. The Germans, occupying La Haye Sainte, expended all their ammunition and fled from the post. The French took possession of it, and, as it flanked our knoll, we were obliged to abandon it also and fall back again behind the hedge. The loss of La Haye Sainte was of the most serious consequence, as it afforded the enemy an establishment within our position. They immediately brought up 2 guns on our side of it and began serving out some grape to us. But they were so very near that we destroyed their artillerymen before they could give us a second round.
The brigade's commander, Major General Sir James Kent, later reported to Wellington,
A fresh attack was now made by the enemy along the Great Road and under cover of the farmhouse which they occupied. The evident intention was to keep down the advance of our line by a superior fire from the farmhouse and under cover of it to push on the mass of infantry in its rear along the chaussee. A desperate struggle and fire now took place. I directed all the broken ground that afforded the least cover to be completely lined with troops, but in addition to this, I found it absolutely necessary to increase our fire by moving up the greatest part of the 27th Regiment, which Major General Lambert posted in as good a situation as circumstances would admit. But it was unavoidably much exposed. The regiment behaved nobly and suffered exceedingly. The 95th and 32nd were also near this point and suffered equal great loss. The struggle at this point continued for some hours, but every effort of the enemy proved ineffectual, and he never for one moment gained a footing on the position to the left of the Great Road.
So that sentence by Kempt, the struggle at this point continued for some hours, but every effort of the enemy proved ineffectual, allows us to picture a very drawn-out and bloody struggle for that section of the line.
Captain Jonathan Leach again describes the persistence of the French attacks and the stubbornness with which they were met.
Several times the French officers made desperate attempts to induce their men to charge Kempt's line, and I saw more than once parties of the French in our front spring up from their kneeling position and advance some yards towards a thorn hedge, headed by their officers with vehement gestures. But our fire was so very hot and deadly that they almost instantly ran back behind the crest of the hill, always leaving a great many killed or disabled behind them.
Another indication of the repeated French attacks sustained by the 95th comes from Lieutenant William Simmons in Leach's company, who writes,
I had an impression I should not be touched, and was laughing and joking with a young officer about 4:30 in the afternoon. At this time, I was a little in front of our line, and hearing the word charge, I looked back at our line and received a ball, which broke 2 of my ribs near the backbone, went through my liver, and lodged in my breast. I fell senseless in the mud, and some minutes after found our fellows and the enemy hotly engaged near me. Their skirmishers were beaten back, and the column stopped. 2 men dragged me away to the farm of Mont Saint-Jean, a little to the rear, where Mr. Robson extracted a musket ball from my breast.
It's worth then repeating Simmons' line that this was around 4:30 in the afternoon. He's not referring to the initial massed attacks by D'Erloncourt, but that their skirmishers were beaten back and the column stopped. But the fighting did not stop, however, and instead a firefight continued for hours, the rifles still holding their position, the French firing from La Haye Sainte, and the gardens and fields around. Kincaid describes the clouds of smoke being so thick from the relentless firing that they could not see the enemy, but instead saw only flashes of muskets firing from through the haze. Eventually, though, when Napoleon's final attack failed, the repulse of his Imperial Guardsmen to the west of La Haye Sainte, the farmhouse began to empty of Frenchmen, and the Allied line, where able to, began its advance. For the first time since the night of the 15th of June, the rifles could rest. As with the remainder of Wellington's battered army, those men still standing must have been utterly exhausted. Perhaps the most frequently quoted line in all the histories of the battle comes from Kincaid, the battalion's adjutant, who remarked that he had never heard of a battle where everyone had been killed, but that this seemed likely to be an exception. Let's now look at each of the 6 companies in detail. Number 1 Company, Chawners, 96 men, 8 killed, 38 wounded. This was one of the 2 companies posted in the forward position of the sandpit. Captain Chawner was wounded severely in the leg. According to a typically patriotic account published after the battle, 2nd Lieutenant Alan Stewart engaged in chivalrous combat with a French officer who, with his sword broken, he finished in an instant. However, the combat was not as one-sided as it sounds. Records show Stewart was stabbed through the arm by the French officer and shot in the shoulder. He died in Norwich Military Lunatic Asylum in 1847. Private Thomas Crawley from Grange in Tipperary served in the Peninsula and was one of Costello's friends. Costello relates how Crawley's heavy drinking was starting to get out of hand, to the point that his captain stopped his gin ration. Costello remarks,
"Had sentence of death been pronounced, it could not have sounded more harsh."
Crawley is also mentioned as having given his greatcoat to a French colonel who had been robbed of his clothes after capture, for which he received the personal thanks of General Crawford. Number 2 Company, Leach's, the 2nd Company positioned forward in the sandpit. 97 men, 8 killed, 26 wounded. Many regiments at Waterloo left very few, if any, first-hand accounts. In contrast, this company alone contains 4 men who published their memoirs. There's a wealth of material about Captain Jonathan Leach and two of the lieutenants in this company, the American-born Gardner and the Irishman John Fitzmaurice, and all are central characters you can read about in Mark Urban's book mentioned earlier. As if those officers didn't prove enough detail, this company also contains Private Ned Costello, who's left one of the best known and most popular accounts of life in the ranks from the Napoleonic Wars. He was from Mountmulloch in Queen's County, Ireland. In 1835 he returned to fight in Spain again, this time as a lieutenant in the 7th Light Infantry of the British Legion. As we heard earlier, he had his trigger finger shot off at Quatre Bras. Private John Castles from Paisley had 21 years soldiering under his belt before Waterloo. He had initially served with the 101st Foot from 1794, before joining the 95th in 1803. Aged 39 at Waterloo, he'd seen action at Busaco, Ciudad Rodrigo, Badajoz, Salamanca, Vitoria, Pyrenees, Ortez, and Toulouse. Costello describes him as quiet and inoffensive a little fellow as could be, but that, for reasons unknown, after the shocking, debauched carnage of the sacking of Badajoz, Johnny Castles was nearly hanged. He was taken to a gallows and a noose placed around his neck, but then, at the last moment, let off. Costello states,
"Whether this was done to frighten him or not, I cannot say, but the circumstance had such an effect on him that he took ill, and was a little deranged for some time after."
Number 5 Company, Johnstone's, 95 men, 20 killed, 21 wounded. This was the company positioned initially on the knoll, covering the companies in the sandpit. Its total casualties are similar to the rest of the battalion, but for some reason suffered twice as many men killed. Private James Burke of Kilkenny belonged to this company, another character from Urban's book, described by Costello as a man noted for his daring courage, who had survived being part of the Forlorn Hope, the chosen vanguard of stormers, at the bloody sieges of Ciudad Rodrigo, Badajoz, and San Sebastian. His luck finally ran out at Quatre Bras, where he was killed. On his enlistment, the profession of Private William Dilks, like many of the Leicester men, was listed as a framework knitter, an industry centred on that county. But having lost his arm at Waterloo, this would almost certainly mean an uncertain future lay ahead, to put it mildly. However, he was fortunate enough to be granted an annuity of £6 by the Waterloo Compassionate Fund, which should have at least helped a little. He survived until 1843, living in Nag's Head Yard, Leicester. Lieutenant William Chapman of this company had had an unconventional Peninsular War, being seconded to the Portuguese army, serving as a captain in the 1st Caçadores, the excellent light infantry of Wellington's army, until he was wounded at the Battle of Redina in 1812. The company was commanded by Captain William Johnston, aged 30, from Dumfriesshire. He was wounded at Quatre Bras. Number 8 Company, Lees, 97 men, 12 killed, 32 wounded. Poor Lieutenant Johnston, no relation to Captain Johnston of Number 5 Company, was out of luck at Waterloo.
Of the wounded, Lieutenant Johnston had been brought with Simmons to the farmhouse of Mont Saint-Jean, a little in rear of the position of the battalion. Some riflemen procured 2 horses which had belonged to French cavalry soldiers, on which they set these officers to take them to Brussels. And as they were turning out of the gate, a cannon shot, many of which were bounding along the road, struck Johnston and killed him on the spot.
Private Joseph Arms of Bagworth, Leicestershire, was another framework knitter who would not be returning to the manufacture of stockings, having had the fingers of his right hand shot off at Waterloo. As a consequence, he was granted a generous pension of 9 pence per day on his discharge in 1816, later raised to a shilling. He returned to Leicestershire, living in Hinckley. It's interesting to see from the correspondence of Waterloo prize money that letters were often not addressed to a street with a house number, as we would today, but rather were addressed to a nearby shop or pub, which would be easy to find, for the shopkeeper or pub landlord to then hand over the letter to the addressee when they next saw them. It's a fascinating indication of just how close-knit communities across the British Isles must have been at this time. For example, the letter to this Private Joseph Arms concerning his Waterloo prize money is addressed to simply Mr. Hulses, the Draper, Hinckley. Private James O'Neill of this company, a Wexford man, collected his 5th wound at Waterloo, having been wounded in the forehead at Montevideo in Uruguay in 1807, then in the left leg at Vimiero, then again in the leg at the Coa, both in Portugal, then in the right hand during the Battle of the Pyrenees, before finally losing a finger at Waterloo. Captain Henry Lee, only 26 in 1815, ended up in command of the battalion by the end of the day at Waterloo, every senior officer having been wounded. Number 9 Company, Glass's Company, 92 men, 9 killed, 35 wounded. This company had a particularly hard time at Quatre Bras. 4 men later died of wounds, but the 5 men killed in action are all listed as killed on the 16th of June. 4 of these 5 men were English: Sergeant Anthony Houghton from Derbyshire, Corporal Tom Blandford and Private John Green from Essex, and John Cowdrey from Northumberland, while the 5th man was Welsh, Private Moses Blythew from Denbigh. Colour Sergeant George Baller of this company from Chewton Mendip in Somerset is one of those men whose life story would make a good film. It's far too colourful to cover here, but a very brief and inadequate summary would be that he served in the Peninsula from 1809, being wounded in the left hand at Almeida and taken prisoner, escaping from prison, joining the guerrillas under the command of Don y Mina, with whom he fought, wounded again, this time in the left leg by a Polish lancer, made his way to Valencia, where he embarked for Gibraltar, from whence he sailed again to Portugal, where he rejoined the regiment. Made sergeant in 1812. In 1814 he was wounded in the breast by a bayonet during the storming of Merksen near Antwerp, and also received 2 musket ball wounds in the right arm, one through the wrist and the other above the elbow. Because he was wounded, he remained in the Netherlands until Quatre Bras, where he returned, received a gunshot wound in the right shoulder, but presumably hung around as he was then wounded again at Waterloo in the right leg. All of this, and yet, on his discharge in 1816, he was still only 29. Number 10 Company, Beckwiths, 102 men, 10 killed, 32 wounded. Charles Beckwith, number 10's commanding officer, was not with his company, serving instead at Waterloo on the general staff, in which capacity he was wounded by a musket ball and lost his leg. In his absence, the company was commanded by Lieutenant John Layton, who was himself wounded in the wrist at Quatre Bras. Sergeant Edward Lee of this company from Nina, Tipperary, is described in Costello's memoirs as the best boxer in the regiment. Their paths first seem to have crossed after the Battle of Vittoria, where Costello had to defend the loot he had piled up from the attempts of Sergeant Lee to steal it. The 2 men were reunited in hospital in Brussels after Waterloo, where they ended up in adjoining beds. Sergeant Lee had been shot just under the clavicle, and Costello writes that the poor fellow died after the amputation of his arm. This is not true. Lee's arm was not amputated, he recovered, and he was only discharged in 1819, aged 40, when the regiment was reduced. The casualties were high. Of 609 all ranks, 71 were killed and died of wounds, and 173 wounded, which is a 40% casualty rate. As with the other regiments in the brigade, casualties were particularly severe for the officers. Both the commanding officer Andrew Barnard and Major Alexander Cameron were wounded, as well as 3 captains and 13 lieutenants. That's 66%, and those figures get worse if you include Captains Charles Beckwith, who was absent serving as an assistant quartermaster general, and we've already heard was hit by a musket ball and lost his leg, and Captain Charles Smith, who was killed while among the 32nd Foot, acting as brigade major. Following Waterloo, the 1st Battalion occupied barracks in Paris on the Rue de Clichy as part of the occupation. Despite the casualties, an inspection of the 1st of October 1815 shows that, in terms of its high standards and quality, the battalion remained undiminished.
All the officers appear to understand their duty in the field and quarters, and are intelligent and zealous in the performance of the regiment. Unanimity and good understanding prevail in the corps, and the officers afford the commanding officer every support. The privates are a very fine body of men, healthy and extremely clean. They're well drilled and sober. This battalion is in the highest possible order.
6 months after Waterloo, on the 16th of February 1816, in honour of its extraordinary achievements throughout the Napoleonic War, the regiment was removed from the other regiments of the line, ceasing to be the 95th and becoming instead simply the Rifle Brigade. It would serve as such through the Crimean War, the First and Second World Wars and beyond, and was only amalgamated to form the Royal Green Jackets in 1966. Forming part of the occupation following Waterloo, the battalion remained in France until November 1818, when it finally recrossed the Channel to return to Dover. It next sailed to Scotland in October 1819 to help put down political unrest in Glasgow and Paisley, and would be occupied in that capacity in what became known as the Radical War for a whole year. On March 28, 1820, for example, a newspaper reported that
on Monday evening, after it was dark, a mob passed through a number of streets in Paisley with a tar barrel in flames. The police officers, afraid of mischief, endeavoured to disperse the crowd and extinguish the flame, but finding their efforts unavailing, a party of the Rifle Brigade came to their assistance. The rabble were charged and several bayonet wounds inflicted by the riflemen.
Next stop in late 1820 was Belfast, where the battalion was divided into detachments and stationed in numerous towns across Northern Ireland. Over the next years it would move south and be stationed variously at Cork, Fermoy, Kilkenny and elsewhere, often engaged in suppressing major uprisings. In the previous episode we heard of the torrid time the Cameron Highlanders had at Newcastle in County Limerick, and of Lieutenant Ewan Cameron dying after being attacked there in February 1822. That same month, a company of the Rifle Brigade was also marched to this turbulent town. On the march, just outside Kildorrery, County Cork, 3 carriages travelling ahead, filled with the wives of the battalion's NCOs and privates, were attacked by a group of men going by the name of Captain Rock's men, and those women that did not flee were raped. The regimental history describes this part of the county as in a most disturbed state. Like the Cameron Highlanders last week, respite came by being posted to Canada, although only 6 companies of the battalion embarked, with 4 companies remaining in Ireland to form a depot for recruitment and supply. This arrangement lasted many years, the 6 service companies being stationed around various parts of Canada, while the depot companies eventually left Ireland in 1829 and were stationed around Dover and the south coast, where they were engaged primarily in trying to catch smugglers. Many of the officers and men of the famous 95th went on to have eventful careers outside of the military, ending up in far-flung corners of the globe. Lieutenant William Shenley in Glass's company at Waterloo retired from the army in 1825, entered the diplomatic service, being appointed consul in Venezuela, Jamaica, Haiti and Havana, was friends with Byron and Shelley, and eloped 3 times. He entered Parliament until embroiled in a votes for cash scandal, although this seemed to do him no real harm, as he died a millionaire in 1878. The story of Lieutenant Orlando Felix is perhaps equally remarkable. Aged 23 in 1815, he survived being slightly wounded at Quatre Bras in No. 10 Company and served on with the regiment. Whilst posted in Ireland, he came across a book in a library about Egyptian hieroglyphics, and when the Rifles were later posted to Malta, he took the opportunity to travel to Egypt, accompanying a diplomatic envoy. Thus began an academic career which saw him become a leading Egyptologist, publishing works on the pharaohs and hieroglyphics, which were translated into French and Italian. He also explored Ethiopia, rose to the rank of general, and spent 14 years in Madras as the Deputy Quartermaster General of the forces in India. He died in Geneva in 1860. Our friend Captain John Kincaid published his Adventures in the Rifle Brigade and Random Shots from a Rifleman, extracts of which we've heard in this episode. He then became Inspector for Factories and Prisons for Scotland in 1850 and was knighted by Queen Victoria in 1852. He died at Hastings in 1862. Lieutenant John Molloy of Lee's Company was recommended to the Duke of Wellington by Commanding Officer Andrew Barnard as one of the best officers in the Corps. Molloy later emigrated to Australia, where he became one of the first settlers of Augusta, Western Australia, and was later appointed magistrate for the area. When, in February 1841, a settler was speared to death by an Indigenous man, Molloy led a punitive expedition, resulting in what became known as the Wannerup Massacre, in which dozens of the local Wadandi Noongar people were murdered. If you've listened to the episode on the 2nd Lifeguards, you may remember a similar story of the Pinjarra Massacre, in which Lieutenant Richard Mears of that regiment was responsible for similar bloodshed of the indigenous people. That had been 7 years earlier and about 85 miles north up the coast. So, 2 ex-Waterloo men and 2 dark days in the history of the colonisation of Australia. Many of the battalion's sergeants transferred their obvious talents as intelligent and reliable men into civilian life. Sergeant Thomas Gilbert of the northwest port of Blyth in Northumberland used the French he had picked up during those years spent in the occupation of Paris to be appointed the translator for the French sea captains trading at the port, where he was described as much respected for his quiet demeanour and unassuming manners. Another Northumberland man, Private Charles Ormond of Leach's company, lived to a ripe old age, dying in 1875 at his birthplace of Alnwick in Northumberland, aged 88. He had joined from the Northumberland militia in 1809 and been wounded 5 times in the peninsula. In Alnwick he worked as a shoemaker and lived in Pottergate Street, which you can see here. We've already heard of several framework knitters from Leicestershire. Well, Private John Pratt of Lee's company was yet another one, from the village of Sapcot. He made the newspapers in 1867 when, at the age of 82, he married a Mary Corkman in her 65th year. But of all the tough old boots living long into their dotage, Private Charles Rivers from Upton St Leonard's in Gloucestershire was almost certainly the last man of the battalion still standing, and possibly in all of Wellington's army. He died in 1886, aged 102, an extraordinarily long life. So let's leave the 1st Battalion of the 95th there. Many thanks as always to the excellent contributions by those kind volunteers who read the extracts in this episode. In particular this week to the riflemen, past and present, who kindly participated. It's always fantastic to have this continuity, to have modern members of the descendant regiments reading the words of their 1815 counterparts, so thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like and subscribe if so. The podcast is now available to listen to on Spotify, so give us 5 stars there if you can. I believe it helps in some way. Next time we'll be looking at our first Royal Artillery Battery, Lloyd's Battery, but until then, thank you very much for listening.